Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Okay, so just kind of quick, I guess, recap. This is a list that covers through about verse 20 or 25 or so of what we talked about. You'll notice this first block of things that he dealt with, which was essentially murder and disobedience or disrespect toward parents, kidnapping, and battery. Well, I guess stopping short of battery. All of those things, the penalty was death. These are maximum penalties. The ones that have asterisks mean that there are exceptions that are provided in the law, or there are modifications that are provided under certain circumstances. For instance, under the murder statute, if it wasn't murder, essentially if it was what we call manslaughter, then you were not executed for that. But if it was murder, then the penalty was death. Being disrespectful to your parents, either hitting your parents or cursing your parents, got you killed. That was pretty straightforward and strict. Then there's this block here. There's another one that we got to down here that involves death, but we'll get to that in a second. We've got battery. If you strike someone, you had to give compensation for that. If you mistreated your slaves, you were punished. If you injured a pregnant woman, there was a fine unless the baby was killed. And then there was death. If you committed battery against your servant, if you struck your servant in the eye or the mouth, it says even if he lost a tooth when you struck him, you had to release the servant, and there was no redemption cost that was to be paid. They were just to go free. And in fact, that introduces something we didn't talk about, but this gives me a chance to bring it up. Have you noticed so far what's missing in the punishment of all of these things in the law? With the exception of death, when death was pronounced, okay, there's no confinement at all, and there is no beating. You think about the Roman form of government that would come in the New Testament age. What was one of the things that they used a lot? The scourge. They beat people. The law that came from God did not provide for any kind of abuse like that. The only thing that was corporal at all was when the death penalty was engaged. And so that makes it somewhat different than even modern systems of jurisprudence that almost all universally involve imprisonment. If your cattle killed someone and it was just kind of a freak accident, you had to pay a fine. If, however, you knew, for instance, that your ox had a tendency to gore someone, what was the case? Not just the ox was put to death, but the owner was also put to death. If he knew that it had a tendency to do it, and he didn't do anything to try to stop it or prevent it from happening. Property liability is restitution. If your cattle kills other cattle, it's restitution. If there's a non-recoverable theft, it's restitution with a penalty. If it's a recoverable theft, it's a measure of restitution with a penalty. If there's mismanagement of your cattle, you let them graze on someone else's property and they eat the crops down to the ground, you had to pay back with the best of your crops. And that's kind of one of the things that's very important to note. When you paid it back, you didn't pay it back with the least valuable thing you had. You paid it back with the best of what you had. Negligence, you left a hole in the ground, somebody fell into it, or someone's animal fell into it, there was a restitution and penalty that had to be made for that. Trust violations and bailment damage. What is bailment damage? I put that up there that way. I want to make sure people know what it means. That's when you have property and you have put it into someone else's possession, whether it be a loan or whether it be by some kind of agreement, a rental agreement, where my property is being used by somebody else. I think the example in the text was someone borrows my ox to use and something happens. If the ox is damaged, then the person is liable to me for that. If it's a rental, however, it said what? The rental fee is it. You charged them for using it. The thing happened while they used it. That's just what you got paid is all you're going to get. So there's that discussion. And now we kind of get into the area of where we are tonight. So look with me verses 16 and 17 first, and then we'll move on from there. I'm going to break it down this way. Probably 16 and 17, then I'll deal with verse 18 by itself, and we may block the rest of them from 19 through 31 together and deal with them a little bit more quickly. But anyway, if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the dowry for virgins. Okay, there's a lot that has to be unpacked so that we can fully understand what this is talking about. There is another place that we will rely upon, I guess is the way I'll say it, to get more information. So if you want to go ahead and turn over, keep Exodus 22 marked, but turn over to Deuteronomy 22. The Deuteronomy discussion about this topic is much more detailed, and there's a lot more information that's given. And so we'll refer to it as we talk about these things. So what you have described here is a fella that runs into a young lady. She's not betrothed to anyone. He doesn't go through the normal channels, which would be to go to her father and to say, hey, I'm interested in your daughter, and strike an agreement and have an engagement and go through the engagement process and then get married. He doesn't do that. Instead, he pressures the young woman and talks her into a relationship, a physical relationship. And so What do you do in that situation? How is that handled? And that's what this is talking about. Look at verses 28 and 29 of Deuteronomy 22. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin who is not engaged and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. So there's a price specified. And she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. Now, this is very specific and very clear. And in Deuteronomy 24, Moses famously sets forth the principles upon which a man can give a woman a certificate of divorce, right? And that comes up in the discussion that Jesus has with the Pharisees in Matthew 19. And he says, if you go back to the beginning, that wasn't what God intended. But Moses did it because of the hardness of your hearts. But in this case that he's describing here, divorce wasn't even an option then under the law. If that is how you behaved and that is what you did, when it's found out, the obligation is you owe the father the dowry price that you would have owed anyway. You marry the young lady, and divorce is off the table. And you got that 50 shekel dowry. I can't tell you how much money that was in terms of value comparably to us. I have a funny feeling it was a fairly substantial amount of money and not anything light. What's the purpose of even having this requirement that you got to pay the dowry and you got to marry her? Why did he do that? Let me back up. Let's talk about this from today's perspective. This is describing, what is this describing? It's not really describing rape. Some people read it that way, especially because it says he seizes her in the Deuteronomy account. It's not really, the implication is that there's consent, if you look at it on the whole. But what would we generally call this today? Okay, fornication is what we'd call it. You have no adultery here because you're not married and this person's not even engaged. Now, there's a big distinction, for instance, in the virgin that's being discussed here and Mary, because Mary was what? She was betrothed, which is why Joseph reacted the way that he reacted when she was found to be with child. Because once you're betrothed under the law, there's an expectation of fidelity. And so this is talking about what generally we would just refer to as fornication. What is the general view of fornication today? Let's talk about it from a worldly perspective. What's the general view of fornication from a worldly perspective today? Yeah, nobody even raises an eyebrow. That's just natural. You expect it. And in fact, from a worldly perspective, if someone does not engage in premarital relations, that is found to be odd. The expectation is that these things will happen. At the time of the giving of the law of Moses, clearly the expectation that God is putting forth is what? That it is not supposed to happen this way. But if it does, we're going to have to set it right and go back and do what should have been done to begin with. What should have been done to begin with is that there is an engagement, a dowry, and a marriage. And he said this has got to be a permanent marriage, which puts into perspective that, you know what, you can't be flippant about this. And that's what people do today with fornication. It's no big deal because I'm not married. I don't have any obligations. If it happens, it happens. And I can go on and I'm still free. And basically God is saying, no, no, no. You marry this person and you can't divorce someone who you've engaged yourself with in this way. This is a permanent marriage. That puts some great weight of importance on it. So if a young man runs into a young lady and he says, wow, that's a nice looking lady, he's thinking twice about doing something like that, because if it's found out, this is a permanent marriage. What happened, though, if the father says, absolutely not? I don't approve of the man. He ain't fit to be my daughter's husband. Well, that's what he's dealing with here. If the father absolutely refuses to give her to him, and the key word is absolutely, he is just immovable on the subject. I am not giving my daughter. It says the dowry is to be paid anyway. Why the dowry to be paid anyway? That's exactly right. She's now damaged goods. People were not looking for promiscuous women who have had relations when they were looking for their wives. They were looking for pure women. And there's a good chance that when a subsequent suitor came along, once he found out that she was no longer a virgin, he would say what? I'm not interested. And so there is some damage done, and that damage is legislated to be covered. Now, it's possible that she might find someone who wants to marry her at some point, but it's also possible that she doesn't find anyone. And so he says, look, you got to do this anyway. Plus, it still levies a cost to someone who would do this, which makes us put more weight on the matter. Why do people, I'll use Lafayette as an example, why do people run through red lights in Lafayette and drive 10 miles an hour with the speed limit? Why do they do it? I mean, if you've driven in this town more than 20 minutes, you've seen someone run a red light and you have been passed by 100 people driving above the speed limit. Why is it so widely done? Because nothing is done about it. People do not get stopped for it. People do not get ticketed for it. Nothing is done. About 15 or 17 years ago, we had a mayor that said, hey, we need to do something about this. And he put cameras up everywhere. Wasn't even criminal. It was just a civil fine that was levied when someone was caught doing that. What did people do about those cameras? They threw such a stink that the next guy that got elected mayor, what did he do the first week he was in office? Had them all removed. Now, what's interesting is, for the couple of years that we had them, you actually started seeing people start driving differently. Because all of a sudden, there was a cost for that kind of behavior. And so people thought twice about what they were doing. They said, wait a minute, let me check my speedometer. I don't think most people are speeding going, you know what, I'm insisting on speeding and I'm going to drive this much. You know what I think most people do? They just never look at their speedometer and they just go with the flow of traffic because nobody cares. But as soon as there was a price for it, they start looking at their speedometers, they start watching the lights and actually stopping. Here in the last couple of days, I have seen people drive through red lights that were like, really had been red for a long time. Like people that were behind me, and it was red before I got to the line to stop, and they still blew past me and went through the light. There's no penalty associated with it. And so there's no value to anyone. The minute you do this kind of thing, people start realizing that this actually matters. And by the way, the reason fornication is such a widely practiced thing today is for the same exact reason. There is not even any social stigma cost anymore to it. For a great many years, there was a social stigma that was associated with it. But that's gone, completely gone. And all the laws against it were taken off the books, and the social stigma's gone away, and we're even at high school and middle school levels in this country saying, hey, you just got to expect that these people are going to do this, and giving essentially our consent to it. God is saying this is behavior that should not happen. And he's building into his law a recognition of that. When you look at the further expounding, which by the way is, between this passage in Exodus 22 and the passage in Deuteronomy 22 that starts in verse 23 and goes all the way through verse 27, you actually find out that if there's an engagement, if you're betrothed and this happens, what's the penalty? Anybody know? It's not covered in the Exodus passage. It's actually covered in the Deuteronomy passage. You were put to death. So you'll recall, for instance, the woman who was caught in adultery and brought it. She was caught in the very act. If you were betrothed, if you were engaged, it was considered adultery. And with adultery, both the man and the woman were to be put to death. Unless what was the case? And this is where something that was brought up a little bit earlier comes into play. Unless it was forcible. And so if the woman was taken without her consent, then only the man would be put to death. But if it was consensual, they were both put to death. And that's exactly why the Matthew record of Mary and Joseph's reaction, where it says he wanted to put her away privately. Why did he want to put her away privately? If the community found out about it, she would have been put to death. Because the assumption would have been what? That she was guilty of adultery. And so he was going to do it, making us low, because he didn't want that to happen to her. But he didn't want to go through with the marriage anymore either, until God told him, don't worry about it. You go ahead and take her as a wife. She hasn't done anything. And so that's why that whole thing unfolded the way it did, and that's how these laws affected those decisions and what happened there. This record in verses 16 and 17 is clearly not the full and complete, and it's, like I said, verses 22 through about 29 in Deuteronomy 22 that expands on this quite a bit. The only thing I'm introducing that idea in here for is because we need to keep in mind as we're reading all of these laws from chapters 21 through 23 that this is not an exhaustive list, that these are representative of what he's talking about, and it's not even a full discussion of each law. It's just the basics. You shall not allow a sorceress to live. There's one of my examples of just a weird, what does a sorceress have to do with fornication? And the answer is, well, not really a lot. But we get to verse 18, and it's just this general, and this is the only discussion about sorcery in this whole chapter. Just this one verse says, you shall not allow a sorceress to live. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And so it should not be misunderstood to be sexist law. It was equally applicable to male and female. It's the feminine form of the word that's used here, so they translate it as. Now, by the way, if you're reading the King James Bible, what word is here? Which. The word which is here. If you get to the passages that are dealing with the male side of this that use the masculine, it's the word sorcerer that's used. Anyway, what was sorcery? Okay, it did have connections to. There's some interesting connections that a lot of people don't put with it. The Hebrew word that's translated witch or sorceress in here is a word that means to incant, to speak an incantation. And so when we think literary portrayals of witches, what are they doing? They're incanting spells. Okay, so there's an aspect of this that is connected to that. However, the Septuagint, anybody know what the Septuagint is? That is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. It was done in North Africa, actually, at the Library of Alexandria. It's called the Septuagint. The word Septuagint means 70. And there were 70 scholars of the day that took the Hebrew Scriptures, translated them into Greek. Greek was the international language of the day, and they wanted all of the wisdom of the world in the Library of Alexandria. They took the Hebrew Scriptures, they translated them into Greek and put them there. That text is important because it was either actively used in the first century by the Lord and his apostles, or the record of the Holy Spirit uses it to quote from. So we know that the translating of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, even though the Greek translation was not perfect, it had some issues. It still was, I guess, approved of God. If Jesus quotes from it, that's pretty good. If that's the text that he used to teach people, that's pretty good endorsement for using that text. But anyway, the word that the Septuagint uses here is the same word that's used in the New Testament regarding this kind of behavior, and it is the word pharmakous, which you might recognize sounds an awful lot like pharmacy. And that is exactly what that Greek word implies, is the use of potions, drugs. And so you put these things together, and what we're talking about is people who, and whether or not they could actually do anything doesn't matter. Whether or not it's real doesn't matter. I don't believe that black magic is real. However, there are people who engage in these practices. There are people who do incantations trying to influence people's behavior and get their way in the world and wish ill on people. Think voodoo and other things like that. Very often, what accompanies those kinds of requests and those kinds of people? Raise your hand if you're, well, let's see, I was born in 69, 55. You're going to have to be, you're probably going to have to be at least over 65 to immediately recognize this song, unless you're just into music like I am. You ever heard of a song called Love Potion Number 9? What is Love Potion Number 9 about? It's about a potion that you would have gone to a witch, a sorcerer, a voodoo priestess, whatever. And if you slip this potion to this person, what would happen? They fell in love with you. They became amorous, and they fell in love with you, and you got your way. We do have a version of that. Rohypnol. It was actually developed for some other purpose, but it gets used. Date rape drugs. That kind of thing is what this is talking about. I just saw a silly little video on social media today where a guy walks up to a girl and says, can I buy you a drink? And she says, no, it's bad for my legs. And the end of it is suggesting that she becomes amorous. People use wine and beer for that purpose as well. You get someone a little intoxicated and they'll do things that they wouldn't do. It's any of that kind of behavior where you're trying to abuse other people to get something that you want without having to pay for it, without doing it the right way, cut a corner, something that I know somebody won't do, but if I do this, maybe I can get them to do it. Do we have any examples of that actually in the scripture? What about Lot and his daughters? They wanted to have a child, and all the people that they knew were dead. And they said, there's no men. How are we going to have kids? There's no men. So they said, look, our father's the only one that's here. Now, he's never going to have a child with us, so what do we need to do? Let's get him drunk, and then he'll lay with us. This behavior apparently was practiced widely, where you went to people and people said, you know what, we can help you get the things that you want. Say this incantation with me, go through this routine with me, take this potion with you, give it to the person, and you'll get what you want. He said, look, if people are practicing that kind of behavior, they're to be executed. Is that a serious thing? And the answer is yes. You put the death penalty against something, and you're saying this is a serious breach. Ultimately, what you're doing is not seeking help from God, but thinking that you can turn to yourself. We can solve this problem, and you do it without any consideration of other people. You're trying to get them to do things that they don't want to do. And that's just wrong on every level. It's an affront to God. It's a mistreatment of your fellow man. It certainly doesn't fall underneath the idea of doing to others as you would have them doing to you, which is based upon the second great law, which is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You don't want anybody to do this to you, do you? There are other passages of the Bible that talk about this, tell you not to give people wine so that you can take advantage of them. And it's all the same principle. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. What do we call that? Bestiality. This is not talking about your dog sleeping at the foot of your bed. This is talking about lying with an animal, just like it talked about back in verse 16, if a man seduces a virgin and lies with her. It's talking about the same thing. Bestiality is not anything new. And it hasn't disappeared from the earth. Do people still do this kind of stuff? Yes. Luckily, with this particular one, there is still a social stigma. But if we live long enough, there probably won't be in this country a social stigma with it. Because I've already heard people making noise along the same lines that they have with other forms of immorality, where they basically say, hey, who gets to define what love is? There's a man actually somewhere who claims to be married to his car. Saw a documentary about it. Absolutely blew my mind, but he claims to be married to his car. He sleeps in the garage with his car. I don't understand what goes on. I think people have mental issues when they do stuff like that, but it just disregards altogether that nothing else on the earth is a fitting partner for man. The part of Genesis 2 that is overlooked is that Adam looked at every other created thing and said, what? There is not a suitable mate for me. And so God did what? Took a rib from Adam, fashioned it into a woman. And when Adam was given the woman, he said, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken from man. And then the text says, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And again, when you fast forward to Matthew 19, and Jesus is having the conversation about divorce with the Pharisees, he goes back to that teaching and says this was the intent and the design of God from the beginning. Bestiality flies in the face of that. It suggests that some other lower life form, some beast of the field that God has made, can be a fit mate for me. When God has already revealed that they are not. And that the reason why there are male and female humans is for that relationship. So this is part of civil and even moral and religious obligations to your fellow man and to God that's under consideration here. Which is why the very next verse deals with idolatry. He who sacrifices to any god other than to the Lord alone shall be, and this is the interesting one to me, shall be utterly destroyed. Up until this point, shall be put to death, shall be put to death, shall be put to death. When it comes down to the practice of false religion and the offering of sacrifices to something other than the one true and living God, he says they shall be utterly destroyed. Which then also explains why all of those nations that they would later go in and utterly destroy, that it was justified to do that. Because what were all of those nations doing? Offering sacrifices to something other than God. And so when God said, go in there and utterly destroy them, he was activating Israel to be his minister and to avenge this principle. That's what that was about. Had nothing to do with the people, had nothing to do with the value of the people, had nothing to do. Listen, they were all from the three sons of Noah. Had everything in the world to do with the fact that they were not recognizing God and they were offering sacrifices to something other than God. And he said, look, the price for that is to be utterly destroyed. So Israel, you're given the command. You go do that. You go utterly destroy them. And this is the foundation upon which that command was given. Got to stop. Think about these things and think about them as we move forward. We're going to be talking about mistreatment of foreigners. We're going to be talking about charging interest. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things that govern their daily behavior in life. Appreciate your presence and your participation. For those that are visiting, we take a break, let everybody come in from the classes, and we have a brief period of song worship and a brief invitation that's offered at the end of the hour.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout.